Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture. We're going to do humanitarian intervention, um, responsibility to protect um, for today's class, or for today's quite, brief lecture. So, when we talk about humanitarian intervention and we talk about the responsibility to protect, what we're really talking about is the idea of sovereignty. So, state sovereignty. And this is part of the state system, which was developed or created in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. And just to set some context, the Treaty of Westphalia came out of the 30 Years' War, a war that was fought over religion. So the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting over religions in, trying to win over um, the other side to their position with regard to religion. And then eventually in 1648, the powers realized, well, this is really costly, and I don't really care if you go to hell. So you can go and do what you want in your own country. So if you want to be a Catholic in France, or if you want France to remain a Catholic country, that's France's business. And if Germany, or what was known as the German Confederation, or the Holy Roman Empire at the time, that was supposed to be Protestant. So you have this respect, this mutual respect, for whatever goes on within a specific territory. So that's what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is this respect for what goes on in another country. So, for example, another good thought would be sovereignty. The diktats of sovereignty would say that Iran has a right to pursue nuclear weapons within its own territory, or nuclear energy. That's its sovereign right to do what it wants in its country. Now, what happens when there's a genocide, or there's mass atrocities like ethnic cleansing, or the internment of minorities, or any oppressive thing that's going on? So, what happens when human security is threatened? Okay, what rules are in place that inhibit or encourage even states from interfering in another country's affairs, right? So that's the essential aspect, or the essential idea of sovereignty, is that no other country can interfere. However, in terms of the norms that we defend, there's going to be sometimes uh, countries get together and they establish what is good practice, what is good what is to be done regarding um, crimes against humanity, right? And that's humanitarian intervention. And we're going to talk about that today. So, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with the worst crimes of humanity. We're dealing with genocides. We're dealing with the ability, the ambition to destroy or eradicate a certain group from a country. Um, so, genocides, these are basically state-led um, ambition to just eradicate a threat. So we saw that with the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, but we are also seeing some of that today. We're seeing some of that today in China with the Uyghur internment of hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Muslims in camps, internment camps. And the question is, you know, why isn't the West doing more? So with Rwanda, there was an effort to um, solve the genocide in Rwanda, albeit there was a very slow response. Um, and so the question is, why are states so slow? Why do states intervene in some cases and not others? And the to define humanitarian intervention, we can call this the use of force that challenges the principle of Westphalian sovereignty. So if as crimes against humanity are being committed in a country like Iran or China, the question is, should the United States and other Western liberal countries get involved, right? Get involved militarily to stop using military force to stop the perpetrators of violence, such as genocide or any other ethnic cleansing, right? So this raises some, not only does it raise some practical dilemmas, but it raises some theoretical issues as well. We're going to talk about this now. So, when we talk about sovereignty, we have to realize that we're talking about the state. But if the state does not protect the civilians within their state, the responsibility to protect kids kicks in when other countries rise to the challenge. Right? So other countries invoke the R2P, the responsibility to protect, in order to save the people being slaughtered or being affected, their human security is being affected. And so there was one particular case in 2011 in Libya, which enabled UN peacekeepers to act quickly to protect civilians. So that was a case of a military intervention on behalf of the people of Libya. So liberals, okay, if you take on a liberal perspective here, liberals tend to argue that all humans enjoy these fundamental human rights. So we're all human beings and we have certain rights, uh, a right to life, a right to some liberty, some maybe food, water, shelter. We have these rights, and these are fundamental. But when they're being abused, then the moral duty is to act and act quickly to defend those individuals. And this has become a norm. So it takes on a constructivist perspective too, because we're talking about norms, we're talking about ideas. Sovereignty is a norm. Sovereignty is an idea. Human security, even though it's a concept, it's also a norm. And so the international community acts in an R2P way with certain humanitarian emergencies. Most prominent in my mind would be in the Balkans. During the Yugoslavian conflict, violence in Bosnia Herzegovina, where NATO forces acted quickly to stamp out Serbian aggression, regarding the massacres that were happening there. There's also the Rwandan genocide, which, of course, was a slow response, but it was still a response. The United Nations did intervene eventually, even though it cost the lives. It was very late. It cost the lives of many hundreds of thousands of people. There's also in Haiti humanitarian interventions there, and also in East Timor. So the critics. What do the critics say? The first critique would be that the idea of human rights, the idea of fundamental human rights, that differs across cultures, across histories, and across different states and countries. So they would say that it has very little empirical purchase. However, this is the one that I think is most compelling, is that humanitarian intervention often destabilized international security. And so when you think about humanitarian intervention, sometimes it causes a lot of harm than good. And also, in many ways, it violates the status quo in the international system. And it causes, in many ways, when certain states act, like the United States acts in to defend human rights, it's not applied holistically or in a general sense. So sometimes the United States and other NATO countries or the United Nations intervenes in a robust manner, and other times they don't. So in China, we've been facing this Uyghur genocide for about maybe since 2016. So it's been about 6 years, and nothing has been done. And even weirder or even more shocking is the fact that the European Union is in the process of signing a free trade agreement with China. So the European Union is supposed to be a bastion for human rights, yet they are signing up and signing China into a free trade agreement with them. So it's kind of contradictory or ironic, whatever however you want to call it, that this sort of thing is happening. Um, so humanitarian intervention is in many ways a destabilizing force, because if the United States were to intervene in China over the Uyghur incident, there would be a war, right? There would be a war. The United States has to realize that, and with Iran too, with what's going on with Iran, with the women's movement there, if the United States were to intervene to defend the humanitarian or the human rights of women in Iran, or people of the LGBTQ community, that would essentially mean war. So how do we balance that? How do we create for countries this incentive to follow the liberal norms that are established, but at the same time maintaining a certain degree of stability within the system? So when I say the humanitarian intervention destabilized international security, there's two things you have to sort of remember. One, that the United States intervenes in places where, one, it's a weak state, and it might be like easy to do, uh, you know, and there's an interest to do it. So in many ways, the Rwandan genocide took so long for the United States and the United Nations to act because it was not on the radar in terms of United States interests. With the Balkans, on the other hand, this was more of a quicker response because it was in Europe's back door, backyard of the European community. Another thing you have to realize, the second thing now, is that humanitarian interventions, if it's being done in, say, large, more powerful countries like China and Russia or Iran, it can basically destroy the stability of the international system. There would be war, right? And that would be suboptimal outcome. So how do we maintain that balance? And it's important to recognize that many people overstate the importance of this norm, but it's a relatively new norm, this norm of intervention in the international system. So during the Soviet Union, there was very little international intervention in terms of defending human rights, humanitarian intervention, and this is during the 1956 in Hungary, or 1967 the Prague Spring. But even if you go back further with Nazi Germany, there was no humanitarian intervention for Jews and the Jewish people during Nazi Germany. And so some of the major crimes against humanity was carried out because of inaction or not even following up with this norm of human rights, which is, again, relatively new. So the use of force, military force, right? Many critics would also argue that humanitarian intervention can only be legitimate as one if it's a last resort. If all diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions are tried and failed, then military intervention can be tried. It can only be done. The second thing is that it can only be done in the very worst of crimes against humanity, and this is the most important, when authorized by the UN Security Council. But as you know, the UN Security Council is based of 5 permanent members with veto power. So if any country like United States or Russia or China decide that this was not in their interest, this humanitarian intervention was not in their interest, then ultimately there would be no human right intervention. There would be no humanitarian intervention. So, but the thing about it, the rule of non-intervention is important, right? Because it protects weak states from strong, more powerful states that decide that certain things must be done for the sake of humanitarian intervention or human rights. And so in this case, sometimes there is a civil war or a sort of conflict within a weak state. And if the United States that decides that it's in their interest to intervene, like in Iraq in 2003, there was no civil war back then, but the United States did intervene in Iraq because it was it was perceived as a humanitarian issue that they needed to bring democracy to Iraq, and of course that caused a lot of it caused a lot of destabilization, and it helped create the environment for ISIS. Another thing to realize is that the right to humanitarian intervention can thus be abused by states that would use these humanitarian type arguments to justify their self-interested acts of war. So, like I was saying prior, sometimes great powers invoke humanitarian intervention to act in a way that is highly destructive. So you basically use military force to take over a country, not because of like human rights is at risk. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the essential thing is that the United country is interested in moving against this country because it has a lot to gain. And so the important thing is that if a country, for example, like the United States or Europe, decided to invoke R2P and humanitarian intervention, and they do it for the sake of gaining state interests or military interests in a region, that this would damage the entire image of the norm and create a lack of legitimacy at the UN or for R2P. So that's important to note. And so I've been using this word R2P for quite some time. It's simply the responsibility to protect. And this is a principle that attempts to replace the debate about humanitarian intervention with a new consensus based on sovereignty as a responsibility to protect people from genocide and mass atrocities, and to rebuild the states and their societies afterwards. So that's the responsibility to protect. So if a country in question cannot provide safety and security for its people, for the societies there, then ultimately it is the responsibility of great powers to go in and do the job for them. Again, so there's 3 pillars. Each state has a responsibility to protect its own populations, and if that cannot be done, then it's the international community's commitment to help these states fulfill their responsibility in a timely and effective manner through the United Nations. So this is important. Like it's a very important concept, because in many ways, when countries fail to protect their citizens, we do have these moments of mass crimes against humanity. Some more critiques of R2P is that it's simply a reincarnation of liberal arguments based on rhetoric. So it's just an idea. What matters is state interests. So if states don't want to intervene, then they're not going to intervene. Many people argue that the reason for the Libyan intervention was to stabilize oil prices and to stop refugees from flooding into Europe. Those are 2 major arguments for the intervention. Whereas in other countries, like what's going on in Ethiopia and Myanmar, there simply has been no action whatsoever. So what's to account? If it's not being applied evenly and fairly, then R2P does not have that legitimization, like it doesn't. So how, I mean, I know that life is not, perfect, and that things can't be applied evenly throughout, but one has to ask questions of why. Why is it that some interventions happen and some interventions don't? Why is it that some lives get to be saved and other lives don't? So this is the main problem here. And so when you go through the world history, right, you go through all the different disasters that we've had, especially in the 20th century, we begin to see this idea of sovereignty and the responsibility to protect. So sovereignty, again, just to recap, sovereignty is this idea that whatever happens within a state is that state's business. But if we do believe in international norms, and I think many of us do, this idea of life being sacred, liberty being something worth pursuing and worth defending. That people have the idea, the ability to feed themselves, to not be put into concentration camps, right? So all of these, if we believe that, then there has to be some mechanism by which a group of a community of countries or states can come together and defend those human rights, defend those norms. Because without those norms, I mean, we've made no progress whatsoever, right? So that's the intrinsic argument, the back and forth. I provided the liberal argument and the realist critique. And with that being said, if there's any questions, please reach out. But thank you very much for your attention. I kept this purposefully short because it's a very succinct debate. So I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.